originally it was estimated there was about 68 million square kilometres of forest naturally occurring in what we might say the pre-agricultural era, before humans started clearing land for intensive cultivation, so probably prior to about 8,000 years ago. Now, we've lost about 40% of that, so we've got about 60% left, and that's about 40 million hectares. And of that, a third is subject to industrial logging. It's impacted by industrial logging. And another third, roughly, has been severely degraded. It's called degraded forest land. Kind of once was forest, but it hasn't been totally converted to like intensive agriculture or something. And that leaves us about 32% or 14 million hectares, which is what we would call a natural forest, or what I like to call primary forest. This forest has been subject to natural disturbance regimes. Most of it has indigenous people living in it, but it's not been subjected to industrial commercial logging. And of that 14 million hectares, only a small part of it, it's actually 22% of the 32%, is in a protected area. So we only have 2% of pre-agricultural forest cover in a protected area globally. And it was interesting, I saw David's statistic for the Central Highlands was less between like 1 point something percent is kind of the primary forest. So globally, the world's forests are under enormous pressure, and very much the same kind of land use pressures that Australian forests are under, and they're shrinking rapidly. So deforestation and degradation is occurring. And Australia has a lot of forest and a lot of carbon in its ecosystem, and that's just some statistics from the FAO. They did an assessment in 2010. It shows you the top 10 most forested countries and the top 10 most wooded, or it's non-forest native vegetation on the right-hand side. Other wooded land. We call it woody shrubland, I guess. So Australia, and the numbers are in thousands of hectares. I've gone from square kilometres to hectares. You just drop off 2 zeros. You want to convert hectares to square kilometres and drop 2 zeros. Divide by 100.
Excuse me, does that include plantation?
Yes, it does.
In that forest?
Yep.
We'll have a panel question session.
But that's all forest. So anyway, Australia has the 7th largest forest estate. Or it's the 7th most forested nation, with 149.3 hectares. And when you look at non-forest, other wooded land, we actually rank number 1. So from a global point of view, Australia's forests, native forests, are global. What I want to do to begin with is discuss the role of forests in the global carbon cycle. Jeanette put up an interesting slide in her presentation which showed you on an annual basis how much and what percentage of fossil fuel emissions end up in the atmosphere, how much are absorbed by the ocean, and how much get taken up by ecosystems and forests in particular. And about half is ending up in the atmosphere, with about a quarter going into the ocean and a quarter going into land. That gets people very confused because, on the other hand, we talk about deforestation and degradation causing emissions of carbon from forests, right? So forests are doing, two things are happening. Forests grow, and when they grow they absorb carbon from the atmosphere, and when we log or otherwise perturb forests, we deplete those organic carbon stocks and release CO2 into the atmosphere. So people often find it very confusing as to what the actual role of forests is. So I've got a series of slides to illustrate this, and it's a stylised illustration of the impact of human activity on the primary carbon stocks in the global carbon cycle over 3 time periods. And this is from a paper we published in the journal Nature Climate Change last year. I'm happy to email you a PDF if you'd like a copy. Okay, so what I've got there are four what would you call, well, there's 2 rectangles, a cube and a cylinder. But they represent the major stocks of carbon in the global carbon cycle. And the numbers are in billions of tonnes of carbon. And this is what those stocks of carbon look like pre-agricultural era, say before about 8,000 years before present. There was a certain amount of carbon in the land carbon stock, and most of that was in forest ecosystems, both in the living biomass, the dead biomass, and the soil. There was a certain amount in the atmosphere, a certain amount in shallow ocean, a hell of a lot in deep ocean, and this fossil fuel stock. And the arrows illustrate the natural exchanges. So there's naturally an exchange of carbon between the land and the atmosphere, and between the atmosphere and the land. Because vegetation absorbs carbon and it also releases it when it expires. And there's also a natural exchange of carbon between the atmosphere and the oceans. And that's really a chemical process, a physical process. Carbon dioxide gas dissolves in water. We all know this when you shake a bottle of, I was going to say Coke, so who drinks Coke? If you drink Coke, it's got CO2. So it's a physical process. Some of the CO2 that gets absorbed into the ocean works its way to the bottom of the ocean and by various processes to do with sedimentation ends up at the bottom of the ocean. And it's a slow process, but over very long periods of time you get a huge build-up of carbon at the bottom of the ocean, which is why that number's so big. And note there are no arrows into or out of the fossil fuel stock. And that's because, effectively, in terms of the timescales, we're looking at the fossil fuel stocks of carbon, oil, coal, gas, do not naturally degas into the atmosphere. It's not a natural one. So what happened when humans came along? So this is the pre-industrial era from about 8,000 years before present to 1850. What did we do? Well, we started deforestation. We started clearing away the natural vegetation ecosystems in order to grow crops. So there was an amount of carbon that was stored in those ecosystems, mainly in forests, that was emitted into the atmosphere, and probably about 2/3 of that went into the atmosphere, and about 1/3 was absorbed by the ocean. So I've just illustrated that with a slither of green. So there's a slice of the green box which is white, which means that stock of carbon has been reduced. A wedge of it is in the atmosphere and a wedge of it is in the ocean. Then in the contemporary era, which is 1850 to the present day, we can see there's a big slab of fossil fuel has been mined and combusted and has got into the atmosphere. Now, because plants absorb carbon when they grow, some of that, as Jeanette explained, maybe 1/4 of that has been absorbed back onto the land, and 1/4 of it has been absorbed in the oceans, and half of it is in the atmosphere. Some people have suggested that we could address the climate change problem, we could solve the climate change problem by refilling the depleted land carbon stock. So there's an amount of carbon here that the system potentially can store, but it's not, because we've cleared the forest. What if we let the forest regrow? Wouldn't that offset the carbon that we've dug up from burning fossil fuel? Well, unfortunately, that's not the case, as some of you might have already guessed by looking at this diagram. So here's a hypothetical refilling of the land carbon stock. That is, if all previously cleared land was returned to its pre-agricultural carbon stock, and then we had zero continuing fossil fuel emissions. Right? So we stopped fossil fuel emissions. This is the scenario. We stop fossil fuel emissions, and we regrow all the forest that's been cleared, so that stock is full again. Well, we're still left with a big slab of carbon in the atmosphere, and we're still left with carbon in the ocean. Right? Because what's happening? Very simple. We have a stock of carbon, an amount of carbon that's gone from the land into the atmosphere, and an additional amount of carbon that's gone from the fossil fuel stock into the atmosphere. So if we refill the land carbon, all we've done is repay the land carbon debt between the forest and the fuel. We're still left with the additional carbon from the fossil fuel stock. So what can we conclude from this? Well, there's still a lot of carbon left in all our forests. We still have a lot of forests left. 60% of it's still left. And a third of that's primary forest. Its carbon stocks are full. So if we were to completely, or if you like, complete global deforestation, let's set this as a project. Completely deforest the remaining 6% of forest by the end of this century, that would increase atmospheric concentrations of CO2 by between 130 to 290 parts per million. That's how much carbon is in the forest, the remaining forest. And of course, current CO2 levels are about what? 400 parts per million. So it's a very significant amount. So if we stop using fossil fuel tomorrow and continued with deforestation, right, there's up to nearly 300 parts per million increase in atmospheric CO2 just from deforestation. So I think we can also conclude that avoiding emissions by protecting high carbon ecosystems from land use change that depletes their carbon stock is an important part of a comprehensive approach to greenhouse gas emission. It doesn't solve the fossil fuel problem, but it makes the climate change problem worse. So if you like, we've got two mitigation problems. The main problem is fossil fuel emissions, because it's so much fossil fuel, and we're burning about 9 billion tonnes a year. Tons of carbon, fossil fuel a year. We're making the climate change problem worse by continuing deforestation. If we stop burning fossil fuel by continuing with deforestation, we actually haven't solved climate change. So that's been by a comprehensive approach. You have to recognise there's two parts to this equation. And I think it's also fair to say that the mitigation value of forests lies not so much in their present net uptake of CO2, but in the longevity of their accumulated carbon stock. So what I mean is, if you look at an annual basis, as my diagram showed, and as Jeanette's slide illustrated, a large amount of carbon is naturally exchanged between forests and the atmosphere on an annual basis. What's important is how much of that is put into a long-lived carbon stock, like the stem of a big old woody tree, or roots, or soil carbon. So the mitigation benefit comes from having a long-lived accumulated stock of carbon somewhere other than the atmosphere, not just in the kind of annual net exchange of CO2. Now, if we decided we wanted to stop growing food in soils, and get all our nutrition by, I don't know, pellets that were manufactured in the factory, and and we could completely restore all the forests that have been cleared for agriculture, it's been estimated that this would reduce atmospheric CO2, and if we did that this century over the next 75 years, 85 years, that would reduce CO2 by between 40 to 70 parts per million. I mean, I think that makes it kind of clear that restoration's got a contribution to make, but it's severely limited because A, we can't restore all the forests that are cleared because we like to eat food, and there's a few more billion people on the way who also want to eat food, etc. So there's strict environmentally determined limits on the amount of carbon that can be restored to land carbon stocks. You can't grow trees where there's not enough water or where it's too cold. And also human land use demands, if you like, to meet basic needs, demands a certain amount of land use. My kind of last point, I think that consistent with our understanding of the lifetime of the airborne fraction of repulsive CO2, the most effective form of climate change mitigation is to avoid carbon emissions from all sources, which means there's no option to cut fossil fuel emissions deeply, and not to continue these emissions under the erroneous assumption that they can be offset in the long term by the uptake of CO2 in the land systems and forests. So as I said in my first point, if we don't stop deforestation, there's potentially up to 290 parts per million more carbon that could be put into the atmosphere. I don't have time to talk. I was going to talk a little bit about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but all I want to point out here is that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change doesn't have any provisions that if you like, force or result or dictate that a country has to protect a particular area of forest. Okay? There's nothing that's going to come out of the climate change treaty negotiations that will be a rule or an agreement that will say these forests here must be protected for their mitigation benefit. Unlike World Heritage Convention lists specific areas because they have universal outstanding value against a set of criteria. And what we're actually protecting is a specific area. And Australia has 3 World Heritage areas that are very much forest focused. There's significant forests in the Tasmanian World Heritage Area, in the Gondwana World Heritage Area, and in the Red Tropics. So they are specific forests in specific locations. Without the UNFCCC, we just get commitments that governments make in terms of national level emission reduction targets, to which forest protection and conservation can contribute to avoided emissions and sequestration from restoration. But you're not going to get anything out of the climate change treaty that will be, if you like, forest specific or regionally forest specific, because it's just dealing with emissions and reduction in emissions at a national level.
And then swollen for a long time afterwards. But the majority of the biomass that was lost was from these fine fuel components that have quite short lifetimes. The main impact of the fire was actually changing the carbon pools from living material to dead material. And again, this is the matrix of sites with the different age classes here, and then the different burn severities. So with the low severity fire, most of the carbon remained in living vegetation. There was some mortality, and it was only in the high severity fire that most of the trees were killed. So what then is the effect of having this change in the forest from biomass in living components to dead components? Well, this is where it's the long-term dynamics of what happens to the carbon. How does the forest regenerate? How do the dead biomass pools decompose? And it's only when you look at each of the components and the relative rates of carbon removal by regenerating and growing trees and decomposition, that you can see what the long-term effect of the fire is. So these different coloured lines show the different components. Again, this was after a high severity fire when most of the trees were killed. So the blue are the dead standing trees. And it takes some decades for those trees to fall over and then to start decomposing on the forest floor. And as they decompose, the brown line is the coarse woody debris. And so there's a build-up of logs on the forest floor, and then they start to decompose. There were some trees that remained alive, here the green, and then over decades they will die, not because of fire, but just as they get older and decompose. And of course the regeneration, which in mountain ash forests is very rapid after the fire. It only takes a few years for sapling trees to be many metres tall with very dense canopies. And when you add up all those carbon stocks, the red line shows you the net change in the carbon stock over a couple of centuries. And it does fluctuate, so the effect of wildfire, it does fluctuate. It's about 17% change overall across those decades. And what we want to do then is compare this overall change in carbon stock from a natural disturbance event with what would happen with human activities. And then lastly on wildfire, I looked spatially at what the change in carbon stock was across this mountain ash forest region in the Central Highlands, taking into account the spatial distribution of forest age classes and fire severity. So the map here is showing the the pre-fire spatial distribution of carbon stocks, with the dark blue being the areas of the highest carbon stocks, mainly in old growth forests that are protected in water catchments. And then here, this map is showing the change in carbon stock due to carbon stock change due to logging. And the main form of harvesting in this forest is clear-furrowing and burning. So the impact of this is removing biomass off-site, combustion of the sludge that remains on site, decomposition of waste. There's a lot of waste produced during the processing of the wood products, and then there's storage of carbon in those wood products. And to sum up all those effects of what happens with the transfers of carbon stocks when you take living standing forest of mountain ash and harvest it and put it into the various products. This triangle shows you where those carbon stocks go in slash, so starting off the bottom here with the slash that's burnt on site, and the blue numbers are the average longevity of these products. And when David Lindenmayer talked about these paper producing forests, well, that's true, that 20% of the total carbon stock goes into paper products, and only 4% of the total carbon stock goes into sawn timber products that would have a lifetime of some decades. And then about 1.2% of those products goes into landfill. Now the longevity in landfill, there's very little data about that. It's not, I'm using other people's published data, and in fact for the calculations here of the proportions going into different products and their longevities, I'm using other published data from the literature that is also used by forest industries and state agencies. So it's the same information that everybody is using. And there's not a great deal of that type of data. Now again, if we look at the long-term dynamics of carbon in this log forest, so I'm assuming a harvest rotation of about 50 years, which is the currently now the common practice. And I'm also assuming that we could have repeated harvests and regrowing without degrading the site. Now that's quite an assumption, but for simplicity, so that the regrowth after each rotation is the same. And I've included here in these carbon stocks not only on site with the generating forest, but also the carbon that is stored elsewhere in products and in landfill. Now the main message here is that when we're comparing carbon stocks from forests managed in different ways, is that we must account for the change from here, a primary forest, and the decrease from that forest is initially harvested, and compare, so the level up here at about 1,000 with the average level of carbon stocks across a harvested landscape, which would in fact be the midline through these blue peaks. It's those two numbers that we need to compare as the net change in carbon stock because of the forest harvesting management practice. The actual rate of growth here of the regenerating forest and the annual uptake of carbon each year in a growing forest is not the relevant metric that we should be using. So it's not a flow-based approach, it should be the net change in carbon stock. And I've added here the line for the effect of wildfire to show you that the fluctuations in carbon stock due to wildfire, yes, they occur, but they're not nearly as great as in a harvested forest. So overall, if we take old growth forest, having measured trees and multi-aged and layered forests, and a mosaic of ages of living and dead material in old growth forest, and we compare that with regrowth forest plus the products that will be stored off-site, the change in carbon stock is more than 50%. Again, I've looked at this spatially, taking the distribution of logging in the past and the predictions of future logging from the State Department's timber release plans. So here, the model affected colours to note is the pale green is the mountain ash forest that we're considering. The pale brown is the mountain ash that has been logged in the past. The pale grey is other forest mixed eucalypt forest types that have been logged in the past. The dark brown is the future plans for logged mountain forest, and the dark grey is future plans for logging other forest types. So it's a significant area of land that is still proposed for logging, and that includes in some of the water catchments. There are certain water catchments that are protected, like the Shensi, Armstrong, Barunda, but there are others that are currently and planned to be logged. So taking that spatial distribution of the carbon stocks across the landscape, accounting for the age class of forests, and what is the total carbon stock in that forest, this pale green area is the current carbon stock. And then if we assume that those forests are not harvested anymore and are allowed to continue growing from their current age classes, continue growing for 50, 100, 150 years, then the increase in carbon stock are these increasing green curves here. The pale, used to be pale orange, curve here is a theoretical carbon carrying capacity. So it's what we have calculated would be the maximum carbon stock that could be stored in this landscape in the mountain ash forest. And it's fairly similar to our curve projected for 150 years. So the message here is that if these forests were able to continue growing to their carbon carrying capacity, the carbon sequestration would be doubled. So in conclusion, I'd just like to illustrate some of the types of scientific evidence that we're working on as researchers that we hope will inform climate policy. So firstly, it's to do with methodologies as to how to improve comprehensive carbon accounting and to improve the current policies in our national and international carbon accounting systems. Secondly, is actually quantifying, doing field measurements to quantify what are the carbon stocks and how they can be valued as environmental services, and to quantify the effects of different forest management practices, so to demonstrate how much more carbon can be stored in an old growth forest. And then thirdly, to use our spatial information to identify where would be the priority areas to protect in terms of the highest density carbon stock forests. Thank you.
And that's the Southern Forestry region.
Can we turn one of the lights off? Is keep the top light off, please?
It's my glasses back on, maybe it was okay. So the green areas here, it should be green, and not particularly green, but it's got these green lines, are state forests. These yellow ones, by the way, are pine plantations, so they're not included in our study. We're looking at native forest only. But you can see it's a pretty significant area of forested land, which we used as our case study. And it's about a quarter of New South Wales state-owned forest estate, state-owned native forest estate, which is about 1.8 million hectares. So the study then tried and attempted to compare the financial net benefits of, or the net revenues, another way of putting it, that the native forestry industry firms operating in the Southern Forestry region are generating from harvesting and processing logs, with the income that the New South Wales government could earn if it ceased to log these forests and instead earned carbon credits. So it found initially that in 2012 very few of the participants in this forestry industry in that draw their logs from the Southern Forestry region were making any money. Overall, the industry lost about $1.4 million in 2012 from our calculations, and the chip mill at Eden, the Southeast Fibre Export, which is the major producer, taking about 70 to 80% of the logs, declared a $3 million loss in its report to ASIC, which it makes every year as a wholly foreign-owned company. Boral, which is a major sawmiller in the region and owns 3 of the major sawmills, mothballed one of those mills at Perkins Bay, and hence the industry's employment dropped from about 330 people to 250. That includes the haulers and the loggers, as well as the people actually working in those production processes. And then on top of this, the New South Wales government, through its Forestry Corporation New South Wales, which controls the forest on behalf of the taxpayers of New South Wales, made losses of about $764,000 that year from selling this native forest timber to these processors. So not only did it not make money for the taxpayers from selling this valuable resource, but it actually lost money from doing that. So that was how the overall industry managed to lose about 1.4 million that year. So what's the reason? So why is the forestry industry, native forestry industry in Australia doing poorly? That's an interesting slide from our paper. You can see the market share of Australia in this export industry has dropped dramatically, about 25% to 15%. 2011, as far as we understand, this decline is continuing apace. And you can see the 2 countries that have taken up that extra shares are Thailand and Vietnam. So we're being squeezed out by those suppliers, and the main reasons are apparently the high Australian dollar, the depressed international wood chip prices, there's been a major drop in those, shrinking domestic sawn and hardwood markets. This is not the export story, this is the sawn and log story. Those markets have been shrinking for many decades. And the strong growth in domestic softwood and hardwood plantation sectors have also squeezed the native forest sector from the state-owned native forest sector. So the national industry has already pointed out in their statements these are the main causes of the industry's decline. Doesn't appear to be any real evidence that the cost of the resource to the industry has gone up due to a shortage of supply. Sometimes it's heard in some arguments. In fact, my analysis of CEPI's, the chip mills asset report, show that the cost of raw materials to them actually dropped in 11% in nominal terms, about 20% in real terms, since 2008. So the raw material cost has been declining. But the real killer for them was that the price that they got for their international wood chip exports dropped much more sharply, by 20%. And that was what has sent them into the red. Anyway, the key findings of our study were that if production stayed about the same as 2012 levels, the whole of this industry in the southern forestry region could be expected to lose even more money this year, about $3.2 million. And over the next 8 years, the industry could lose between 19 and 38 million dollars. That's in discounted present day 2012 dollars actually, so discounted back their future losses. And for the next 20 years, they could expect to lose between 40 million and 77 million. So this industry doesn't look like it's got a very rosy future, and we looked at those. The range is due to different assumptions made about the wood chip price. This is about what they're earning at the moment. We assume they could earn more than that if the dollar started to recover. It has somewhat since we did this initial work. But what's not recovering is the international US dollar price of wood chips. And the reason I could have mentioned very briefly, in case you're worried that Vietnam and Thailand are mowing down native forests, they're not. They're producing this timber in small allotments on farms, cutting the timber apparently when it's very small and selling it off to local chip mills out of homegrown farm-based plantations. And they're doing this very cheaply and quite sustainably, it seems, and that's what's driving down the international price of wood chips, and that's why Australia has ceased being competitive. So, what's the alternative to this? We found that, by the way, the Eden chip mill itself, we found could lose $278 million over the next 20 years. It was foolish enough to continue producing at a loss for 20 years. Obviously, it's not going to. In fact, it's cut down its production already, as I mentioned, by, I don't know what it did, but it's halved its production shifts and it's cut its workforce by 1/3 just in the last year or so. So it doesn't look like it's going to continue for 20 years making losses. What's the alternative use of the forests? Well, we looked at, and Andrew McIntosh in particular, measured what could be gained from the forest as far as reduced emissions if the New South Wales government decided to cease logging these forests. We're assuming a major producer quits the industry and the government looks at alternatives, and one alternative we urge them to look at very carefully is preserving the forests for carbon capture. And we wanted particularly to look at how much they could earn from that, so this was put forward in the policy debate as a very viable option. So Andrew found that the forests would produce about 1.4 to 1.8 million tonnes of carbon sequestration services. So 1.4 to 1.8 million tonnes less carbon would be emitted from these southern region forests if they will cease, if the logging ceased this year. and that will continue for the next 20 years. So very much in line with the work that Keith has done, showing the large increase in carbon sequestration that can occur, and reduction in emissions that if you stop logging. And we then looked at what the New South Wales government could earn from if it could sell these as carbon credits. And we found the gross revenue could be about $32 to $42 million a year in 2014 if it was sold at a range of prices including the current $23 a tonne under the Clean Energy Future Act, and then and also looking at different models that have been developed or used and employed to measure those carbon emissions. Net of forest management costs, these avoided emissions would earn the New South Wales government about $18 million to $28 million in 2014. And you can see over the next 8 years, between $60 to $206 million, and over the next 20 years, $120 to $820 million. That's based on the different scenarios we modelled for the price of carbon. The low price of carbon used there is currently being earned in European carbon markets, which are very depressed. The high price is the $23 a tonne, which was the price put on carbon in the Carbon Clean Energy Future Act. And this is still in place at the moment. So they're the two core findings, basically. But then you can ask, well, what are the employment implications of these two approaches? And we compare those. If logging continues as of the moment, the industry is generating about 250 jobs, adding Forest New South Wales. This is their own offices, brings you down to this number, but the actual industry's employment is about this at the moment. This is what it was a year or two ago, so this is how it's fallen. This is what it would generate if you went just to saw milling only, in our estimations. If we use this income that we've estimated the New South Wales government can earn from carbon credits to fund employment, well, first of all, you have to assess the carbon credits, and Andrew estimates that kind of number of people would be involved in forest management and carbon assessment. Then you'd have additional positions you could fund from that carbon credit income, which I've randomly allocated to putting in roads and infrastructure, tourist infrastructure, forest trails. And as you build up the amount of employment, you could afford to spend extra on health and employment, health and education employment in the region. This, I might add, these figures here for the carbon credit scenario are based only on the very low and modest price of carbon currently being earned in the European market. And if you our estimates and hence meet the mid-range scenario we had for carbon prices, which was used by the Australian Treasury in their modelling of the Clean Energy Future Act in 2011, then you could generate about 5 times more employment by the end of this period that we looked at that is currently being generated by the forestry industry. What about Victoria, you may ask, because Victorians, from its Gippsland forests, and a big forest, its government-owned forestry corporation, is supplying the chip mill at Eden, Sedley, with about half of its timber for chipping, and supplying a similar kind of amount of timber to sawmillers as Forest Corporation New South Wales. So the Victorian government, if it ceased logging Victorian Gippsland forests, which it may have to do if Sedley goes out of production, then it could earn roughly the same amount of money as the New South Wales government from our study. In fact, a little bit more because they're actually selling about 5% more timber from those forests than New South Wales from the Southern Forestry region. And the methodology? Never finished. Sorry. That's 3 more minutes. Methodology was mainly for the financial analysis. We employed mainly publicly available data, including the Eden Shipbuild's reports to ASIC, answers on questions on notice in the New South Wales Parliament, and authors interviews with the CEOs of the Eden Shipbuild and the three Griffith sawmills. To estimate the avoided carbon emissions from ceasing to harvest logs, Andrew McIntosh used the Australian Government's Forest Management Model, FULCRAM, which the Government employs to estimate Australia's Kyoto Protocol obligations, and a refined version of that model. The range of carbon emissions avoided depends on the carbon emission model employed and the emission linkage assumptions be made. The study, as I mentioned, values those those avoided emissions at two predicted price scenarios. The higher one is the one the Treasury used, and the lower one is the current scenario. So how could, you might ask very quickly, how could New South Wales actually earn this income? Well, if the Australian Government placed avoided forestry harvesting projects on the positive list of the carbon farming initially backed, as the previous government was actively considering in 2013, the New South Wales Government could just earn revenue from ceasing logging by claiming Australian carbon credit units. At present, projects that involve planting native forests and avoiding logging of private native forests can earn those carbon credit units, but not projects which involve ceasing existing state-owned native forest logging. You might ask why they've been omitted at the moment. So if the New South Wales Government can't earn Australian carbon credit units from ceasing to log these forests, it could nevertheless sell the avoided emissions directly to the Australian Government under the avoided carbon emission auction system, which the Commonwealth Government is currently developing, the direct auction system. Alternatively, the New South Wales Government could sell these emissions into the global voluntary carbon offset market. However, these voluntary carbon offsets are currently worth only $6 a tonne of avoided CO2, about a quarter of the current compliance market. So the article provides a full explanation of the Australian and international carbon credit regimes. The other, very quickly, we've got one paragraph to go. As several other speakers have mentioned, this is just a narrow financial analysis of a much larger economic analysis that should be done of these two alternative uses of the forests. And an economic analysis would look at some of the broader costs and benefits of the two options, particularly, as Professor Lindenmayer pointed out, unlogged forests provide about twice as much water runoff for agriculture and settlements as log forests do, and as undisturbed forests absorb significantly less water than regenerating forests. This additional water runoff will generate additional agricultural production, urban water supply, income, and related employment. Also, forest preservation is much more likely than logging to support the major industries already in these areas, which are tourism and fisheries, by preserving the region's natural beauty, which is one of its main tourist assets, and fish breeding estuaries. Tourism alone generated 58,000 jobs in this region of southern New South Wales in 2009, and tourism-related sectors generate 60% of the income and employment in Bega Valley Shire in 2012. So ceasing native forest logging would also help prevent ongoing loss of biodiversity. It's also been discussed many species, including the rare southeastern koala, the long-nosed wangaroo, yellow-bellied glider, and others on the edge of extinction in the far south coast of New South Wales. So summing up, the two significant results are that in 2014 and for the next 20 years, Forestry Corporation New South Wales and the hardwood processors in the region are expected to make significant financial losses from logging the southern forestry region under both the low and high wood chip price scenarios. And the New South Wales Government is expected to make significant new net revenue from earning carbon credits from the southern forestry region, if it's even under the most modest assumptions about future carbon prices, if it ceases to log these.
What I've been asked to do this afternoon, is to talk about the global perspective on climate change and where the debate has really got to globally as opposed to the local perspectives we have on it. My background is in the energy business. I worked in the oil and gas industry for a long time, in the coal industry. I've been closely involved in sustainability issues and particularly climate change since the 1960s. And my concern today is to really ensure that we start to seriously address the problem, because so far the world has not really recognised what's happening and taken the action that is required. So I have involvements in a number of organisations in Australia, but also collaborating overseas. And all of those groups are essentially working toward that general goal. If you look at where we are today, we have moved in the 21st century into a completely different world from the 20th century. The context under which we have to start looking at climate change has totally changed, totally altered. And the reason for that is that if you go back and look at the growth in population and consumption, since World War II, we've seen almost continuous exponential growth in both of those. And the effect of that has been that as we enter the 21st century, we're now hitting genuine limits, biophysical limits, to our ability to continue to operate the economic and social system in the way we're accustomed to. The immediate pressure points are essentially the peaking of global oil supplies, energy constraints, climate change itself, and then water and food security. They're basically four biophysical issues. That's leading in turn to a range of financial and social instability, which you can see if you look around the world in countries around the Middle East, in the US itself, in the global financial crisis, and in Europe, from which we really haven't yet recovered. People tend to talk about that financial, social instability in terms of economics, but in reality, most of it was triggered by biophysical limits, the ones I before I just referred to. So what I'd like to do is just focus particularly on climate change. I won't talk about the others in depth because we have limited time today. If you look at the paleoclimate history, that's going back in eons to what has happened to world temperature. Then if you go back about 55 million years ago, we had a very big spike in global temperature, as the diagram demonstrates, at a point called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. I won't get into the detail of what caused that, but it was a big spike in temperature which caused extinctions of many kinds. Following that, the global temperature actually dropped steadily until about 37 million years ago, the Antarctic started to ice over. And after that, the world continued to cool, and about 4.75 million years ago, the Arctic started to ice over. And you can see on the diagram the fluctuation in temperatures after that, until you come right to the far end of the scale, and there's a little blip over the last 10,000 years, which is the period called the Holocene, which is basically the period in which humanity as we know it has evolved. Now, humanity's been around for longer than that, but in its current form, it was very much in that last 10,000 years. And that period's been a period of remarkable stability in climate. The temperature is about 15 degrees C, plus or minus half a degree C. And sure, there have been fluctuations during that period, but they were not that great. And it allowed humanity to develop into its current form. Now, what we're seeing today as a result of the increase in carbon dioxide emissions, primarily, is that we are now about 0.6 of a degree C higher than the peak temperature that occurred during the Holocene period. That's basically the green arrow on the diagram. And we're essentially heading, supposedly, if the world decides to accept the target of 2 degrees C, toward the red line, which, if you extend back in time, the 2 degree C line will take you back to the point at which the Arctic started to ice over. Now, whilst that 2 degrees C is the official limit, in fact, the policies that we have around the world today are nowhere near likely to achieve that. We're actually heading to something like 4 degrees C, which is the upper vertical line. Now, if you go back, take that back in time, then you come to the point where the Antarctic started to ice over. Now, this is pretty fundamental stuff, because what it means is the official objective that the world has set itself, if we were to achieve it, over time, it won't happen straight away, but over time it means that there will be no ice in the Arctic. That means sea levels will increase by somewhere around 6 to 7 metres. If you were not able to achieve that, and we end up following the 4-degree path, which we're currently on, we will see the elimination of virtually all ice at both poles. And that will be a sea level increase of 70 meters. Now, even the Arctic melt, the 6 or 7 metre increase, will lead to fundamental change to major cities like London, Tokyo, New York, Shanghai, and so on, you can name them. It means a fundamental shift in the way in which populations live around the coastline. 70 metre sea level increase would be totally catastrophic for humanity as we know it, given the proportion of population living around the coasts. So what we're locking ourselves into by these targets is in fact a totally different world, and in fact in the current case, the 4-degree outcome, a totally unsustainable world for humanity. So you can say, well, all right, we hear a lot of noise from various people, particularly in Australia today, that the case is really not proven. There's just not sufficient evidence to take on that sort of perspective and do something about it. It's all being too alarmist. So what's the evidence? Well, if you actually look at what's been happening in the Arctic with the melt of sea ice over the last few decades, you can see that the sea ice is disappearing at a rate of knots. We've already lost something like 80% of the sea ice extent, the volume, over the course of the period since 1979. And most of that's gone in the last 7 years. So very big things are happening, and this has the effect of rapidly accelerating the warming that's currently going on, because if the ice disappears, then what happens is you end up, instead of a white reflective surface, with a grey-green sea. And the amount of radiation coming in from space is absorbed in the sea increases markedly. And that warms up the oceans, which is what we're also finding. And it in turn accelerates the warming effect virtually exponentially. Now, if you look at the overall picture of warming, in the diagram you can see the last 4 or so decades. And you can see a continual pattern of warming increase around the world as the colours change from the lighter greeny yellow colours to the darker sort of brownish reddy colours in the picture. And what's most notable about this is the warming at the poles, particularly the Arctic. The Arctic is warming something like 2 or 3 times faster than anywhere else on Earth. Even the Antarctic is actually warming very quickly. So what we're finding is that the evidence is absolutely crystal clear. I mean, we're seeing the sort of warming that is far faster than anything that occurred actually in the lead up to the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum that I mentioned in the original diagram. We're seeing it in the sea ice. I can give you a range of other examples around the world in terms of the way vegetation is changing, the oceans that are acidifying, the coral bleaching, loss of coral is occurring, all of which point to the fact that the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere is now having an extremely damaging effect. And it has got to the point where we're not talking any longer really about dangerous climate change, which was the objective of the 2-degree C limit, which was aimed to prevent dangerous climate change occurring. 2 degrees C now is basically the boundary really between dangerous and extremely dangerous. So what is crystal clear is that the 2 degrees C limit is now too much. And we really have to start changing the way we think about these things to reduce our emissions far more rapidly than is being talked about officially. And of course, in this country at the moment, sadly, we are still having arguments about whether we even have a problem. That's not the case in most other parts of the world. If you look around the world, and even in the last few days, you can, there's major news of agreements between the US and China on seriously now getting into cutting down our emissions. But basically the task is far greater than anything that we've really been acknowledging thus far. So the problem that this poses us is that if you take current policies, we're heading toward a world where temperature goes up by 4 degrees C. There's a lot of talk of saying, well, yes, but it doesn't sound very much. We can really adapt to a 40 degree C temperature increase. You then have to really look hard at what that actually means. And what it means is that you are in a world where the world population, the carrying capacity of the globe, is not 7 billion people, let alone the 9 billion to which we may be headed if you believe the United Nations population forecasts. I think it's about 9 billion by 2050. It's not that any longer, it's basically 1 billion. It means that 6 billion people will not survive the impact of a 4 degree temperature increase. Now that's not something people like talking about, but that's the reality that the science is telling us we now face. So what do we do about it? We just sit and look at it, or do we actually start to take serious action? At the moment, there's a lot of debate, obviously, about the policies that we should be implementing, and effectively the questions of whether we have a 5% emission reduction target, or what the best way we do it, whether it's a price on carbon, or essentially the direct action proposal of the new government. You are trying to solve the wrong problem. It is not a question of 5% emission reduction. It's a question of something like 50% emission reduction by 2020 if you're serious. It's the fact that we have to start seeing emissions reduce by around 10% per annum, virtually from 3 or 4 years' time on a global basis. And essentially, we are a long, long way from anybody, certainly in this country, accepting that is the problem that we have to address. So, whilst we have a tremendous amount of heat being in the debate in this country over the questions of these new policies, they are not addressing the issue that we really now have to confront. At the same time, what we're doing is assuming that our 20th century high carbon model can continue. It's not just a question of emission reductions in carbon. You've actually got to look at the entire structure of both climate change, energy, food and water security. We've moved through, obviously, we've been in one of the biggest droughts we've seen for a long time in Queensland at the moment, and New South Wales and South Australia. There's a lot of debate about assistance for farmers. At the same time, what we're doing is proposing to effectively double or even more increase our coal exports and quadruple our gas exports in the space of the next 10 or 15 years. Now, in the circumstances we're currently in, if the world continues to consume fossil fuels in the way that is being forecast, between now and about 2035, we're going to consume 70% of the total fossil fuels the world has ever consumed. And in the circumstances we're facing, with the inability to even approach a 2 degrees C temperature increase target in terms of emission reductions, then that is just totally suicidal. And Australia is a large part of the problem because we have the world's biggest coal export industry. We are undoubtedly a major contributor to that sort of suicidal thrust, if you like, and if this sort of development is allowed to go ahead, it is frankly totally irresponsible. So we need a completely different approach to trying to solve this from the one that we've been seeing. you can't separate all of these issues. I mean, it's a little bit sort of, you scratch your head at it. I mean, if you look at the drought, undoubtedly, despite the comments, I think, from the Prime Minister and others, the science is making it crystal clear that the impact of climate change is having a significant impact on the climate in agricultural areas in Australia, and therefore is a contributor to the droughts we've been experiencing, and indeed to the very heavy rainfalls that have been occurring in previous years. It's all consistent with what the science is basically telling us. We are then at the same time pouring out increasing coal exports to the world to compound the problem. And at the same time, we're developing coal seam gas industries, which are having a major negative effects on our arable land, at a time when we're going to become increasingly a country under pressure in terms of declining agricultural productivity, declining water availability in critical areas. And so the whole thing is a complete disconnect. And yet we are developing policies in purely silos, both energy, climate, water, food security, which are not interconnected. So we have to move to an integrated solution. If you look at the integration of climate and energy, in this diagram you will see that if you were to burn all of the fossil fuels we currently have in proven fossil fuel reserves around the world, then and you add them all up, that gives you the orange bar on the right hand or in the middle of the diagram. Now, science tells us that we can actually only afford to burn around 20% of those fossil fuel reserves if we want to stay below the 2 degrees C limit. And that's reserves, that's not the resources we have in the ground, that's the proven reserves. So it raises a whole host of absolutely fundamental questions about why are we continuing to explore fossil fuels, and what value do you place on the companies which are doing that? Because at the moment the market looks at all this stuff and says, well, we're assuming that those companies can keep on producing coal and gas and oil, and that's basically the valuation that we attach to them. So, you know, these are issues which are going to fundamentally change the way in which the society and the markets, the financial markets and the economy actually operate, but we're not even at the point of being able to discuss it. So, in the next, I believe in the next year or two, we're going to see some very major developments in the way in which the financial markets start to look at this, because people are now starting to realise, because of the impact of extreme weather events, that we have major risks that the investments that are now being made in coal and gas and so on are actually going to become stranded assets, because in the end the world will get its act together and will stop this development proceeding. So what are the solutions? Well, we really have to now start to move on an emergency basis, because there is no other way essentially to handle this. We now no longer have any non-radical solutions to solving climate change. And that's caused by the fact that if we don't do anything, we're going to see even more severe impacts, and they're going to happen much quicker than people think. If we want to do anything, we've left it too late to take a measured, steady incremental response. We now have to move to emergency action. And that's going to mean radical emission reductions and radical changes to the way industry operates. We do have the solutions. They, in an energy sense, range across a whole range of renewable energies, energy efficiency, cutting back the amount we use, redesigning cities, agricultural systems, the entire basis on which society operates. Very importantly, we have to rethink the whole concept of agriculture and vegetation and forestry, because absorption of carbon by forests is absolutely critical to this problem, and we're going to have to see forestry as a major component of the solution in a way which has been talked about, which we've not really got into. And I come back to the point in all of this is you have to start at the threshold of saying, well, what is the problem? And in this country so far we have not been prepared to honestly articulate what the problem actually is. So I think in conclusion, what we're facing is the fact that we now have a climate change problem that is far greater than anybody's acknowledging officially. The official solutions to it, in terms of things like carbon capture and storage and all the direct action concepts that the government has been talking about recently, are just totally inadequate to address the size of the problem we've got. We do have a range of solutions in which forestry features prominently, along with things like soil carbon and so on. But we now have very little time in which to implement them. So we need a new type of thinking coming through. We need new sorts of leadership. We need coalitions of progressive thinkers from across the spectrum, which probably won't come from conventional politics, because this problem is actually too hard for conventional politics to solve. And I think that's the lesson you learn from 20 years of complete inaction since the original Rio meetings. So the solutions are basically there, and it's up to us now to get together as a society progressively, in terms of progressive thinking, to actually now start to address that with the real vigour that's needed, not just pretending that this is a problem that might just go away. Thank you very much.